Hello, everyone. My name's Jenna Price, and I'm a journalist, columnist, and academic. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet, wherever we are, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend this to any other First Nations people watching. Now, I've read Head and Heart, The Art of Modern Leadership, Kirstin Ferguson. I'm now determined to send it as an anonymous gift to all the extremely annoying leaders I've ever experienced in my life. So I'm very pleased to be hosting this chat with Kirstin, and I'm wondering whether Booktopia does anonymous book deliveries.
No, I don't know. That would sell me out for sure. There's plenty of pretty poor leaders out there, sadly.
Yeah, I'm glad you could join me, Kirstin. And I'm going to be asking you today about your guide and discussing the 8 kind of key elements of how to be a good head and heart leader. So let me ask you this question. I feel like it's interesting. I feel like I've known you forever, Kirstin, but when I check back through our historical timeline, which is our text message exchanges, I discovered that our first interaction was only in 2017. And in all that, you flung a few surprises my way, like the Air Force. Can you tell me how you ended up in the Air Force?
I know. It's as far from my current life. Firstly, I can't believe we've only known each other since 2017 either. It does feel like a long time. But yeah, I was 17. I was at an all-girls school in Sydney at Skeggs, Darlinghurst, as far as you can get from, joining the military. And off I went to ADFA, the Australian Defence Force Academy, very young. And I think there was a few reasons why. I got into journalism actually at UTS, as it was known at the time. And I had a bit of a sliding doors. Do I go and do that or head off to the military? How's that for a sliding door moment? And I chose the military. And I think it was because you got paid to study. That was very attractive as a young person. And I am 3rd or 4th generation military. So I sort of understood the opportunities, particularly as a young officer, you get. And that is what happened. And you focus on leadership right from the very first day, good and bad leadership. And so, no regrets. And it's kind of come full circle. Now I write a weekly column, so I get to do it all, military and a bit of journalism.
Which is fantastic. So I think, when you told me you're in the Air Force, I thought, oh, that sounds exciting, flying planes at high speed. But then I discovered that your very first job after graduation was ending up as a burial officer. And I don't think I've ever told you this before, but I actually got very upset that such a young woman would be cast into that extremely tough job. Can you tell me what happened in that job, how you got there, how you felt, how you dealt with it?
And look, I remember you being shocked as well. And then I was shocked, you were shocked, because to me, it just seemed perfectly natural. So whilst I did marry a guy who flew fighter planes, that's not what I did. I was at a squadron, but I was like a personnel manager. We're called administration officer, very sexy title. But very junior officers, and I was only 21 my first day, get a secondary duty. And, miraculously, a lot of the young men seem to get the football, running and coordinating the football team secondary duty or something like that. But there's a job called burials officer. And I was the newbie that turned up. And before I had even arrived, they must have allocated it to me. And I arrived to work my very first day and was told I needed to jump in a car with the chaplain and go and see a family whose son had just died and organise his funeral. And I'd never even been to a funeral. So my first afternoon was spent in their living room. So that's how it came about. And as shocking and as traumatic as it sounds, 30 years on that we would do that to a young person, I must say, looking back, I'm really proud of that time. And I came to organise dozens of funerals and really enjoyed that part of my job, because you can really help families. And I learned a lot about leadership and a lot about empathy at that time too.
What were the biggest challenges? I mean, I don't think, I do not have the capacity for empathy that you do. And I know that because I've done the quiz, the Head and Heart Leadership quiz. I don't know how a 21-year-old had the capacity to be so empathetic. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened?
Well, I think that first family, they probably did not get a hugely empathetic young 21-year-old. I think I sat there just frozen, not knowing what to do, taking notes and listening to the chaplain. But after a while, you know, you see people in really different ways of experiencing grief, and you know, the different ways people may have died, whether it's sudden, whether it's a child, whether it's a partner, whether it's suicide, whether it's health. And you start to just really appreciate that whatever's going on for someone at that most traumatic time, the best thing you can do is to be there and listen and help them through it as best you can. And so it was a bit of trial and error. And there were definitely moments where I'm sure, you know, if I had a video on myself now as a 22, 23-year-old dealing with this, there'd be a lot of things I'd be thinking, oh no, you know, don't say that. But there's no better way to sort of learn than to go through it.
Yeah. I mean, I was a bit concerned about my understanding of Air Force leadership when you and I had those conversations. I thought, what kind of a person sends a 21-year-old to do that extremely tough job? You were surprised when I responded like that when we first had this conversation a little while back. Looking back now, what do you think about the leadership in the Air Force and that particular decision?
I think you open my eyes to thinking about it from the perspective of whoever allocated that job to a young 21-year-old. I'd only ever considered it from my position, which was I've been given a really tough job to do and I'm going to go and do it as best I can. I think, yeah, that's not doing necessarily the families a service to give them someone so green and inexperienced and potentially lacking in empathy and always going to be lacking in empathy. I mean, I was not tried and tested by any means. Yeah. So I think, you know, it does show a propensity, perhaps it's limited to the military, but I think other leaders do it too, to offload, you know, the jobs people don't want to the most junior people, and yet they're critically important roles. And so it's not something I would do now, and you know, I would never put someone in that position. But it's funny, I still can't help but think about it from my own perspective, and you know, I found it really rewarding.
And probably they could, that their empathy detector probably could tell, oh, you know, she's pretty good at this.
I don't know about that. I don't know that I'd even arrived before I probably got shafted with the job no one wanted. So it's hard to know.
I mean, when we think about what we want to do when we're growing up, I was along the lines of, I always wanted to be a journalist, and I have friends and family who wanted to be doctors and lawyers and scientists and writers, and so, you know, Air Force isn't in my range of possible jobs. It wouldn't have been. How did you get to have that ambition? I mean, you said you were in a kind of third or fourth generation. Tell me how that happened.
Yeah, the military had always been something I was aware of. It wasn't as though I was aspiring to be a lifelong member of the military, but it was not a foreign concept, the idea of going off and spending my early years of my career learning about leadership and having responsibility. So I think that was attractive, and you got paid to go off to ADFA as a young person, so that was pretty attractive too. But interestingly, as I look back now, and I turned 50 this year, so, you know, it's quite a milestone year, I always wanted to be a writer. That's probably been my overwhelming sort of desire throughout my life. And I'd always wanted to do law, and I went and did that. I'm now writing, and journalism. You know, I never expected that I would become a journalist, but I love being involved in the media and having an opinion and sharing that. So funnily enough, I've ended up doing sort of all the things that I had ever thought growing up I would get to. And it's funny how our lives, you end up making conscious and unconscious choices to do those things you're passionate about anyway.
Yeah, you certainly do. And I think in my life, I was always very keen to be a grandmother. And here I am with 2.5 on the way. So I want you to tell us in your own words about the book. I say this with love because you can rattle on a bit. I'm going to give you 60 seconds and I have my alarm. Your time starts now.
I'm too scared to say anything. It's about leading with your head and heart, and it's what every person needs to read because it's what we want from modern leaders. That's it, Jenna. You scare me too much.
That was 11 seconds. I'm so impressed. Tell me why leadership matters to us.
Because it impacts us every day. I mean, as you said at the very beginning, you remember the really poor leaders, and they affect us. They make us move jobs. They make us feel shitty about ourselves. The really good leaders, though, can propel us all over. But I mean, the way I express that, that's thinking about other people as leaders. The reason I think this book is important is it reminds you that we too are leaders. You as a grandmother are leading those gorgeous 2.5 children, grandchildren that you have, as well as your own family, as well as your readers in your columns. You know, all of us are leading. So it's all very well to look out and think about the leaders that make us feel bad, but are we actually looking at ourselves and thinking how we're impacting people as well?
Yeah, well, I did the Head and Heart Leadership Quiz, which I really recommend to everyone. It's so much fun. I've discovered I am shockingly nosy, out of all proportions.
I could have told you that without you doing the quiz. And by the way, anyone watching, headheartleader.com, totally free, takes 5 minutes.
And it's so hilarious and fun. In fact, I knew that I was nosy, but there were things.
It doesn't say you're nosy. What are you talking about? Curiosity.
See, that is just like washing it to be something pleasant. Curiosity sounds pleasant. Anyhow, and my family, when I said to them, "Oh, I've done this quiz and I'm nosy," they're all rolling their eyes. Tell me what head and heart leadership really looks like, because curiosity is an important part of what being a good leader is about, right?
Yes, and no one else is going to call it nosy. You've given it a reframe that is not a helpful one. Leading with your head and heart is all about, like, we reward people at school and at university. You get promotions, you get pay rises based on leading with your head, basically, having those technical skills, being curious about the work that you do, making really good decisions, being able to read the room. And for me, that's the side of leading with our heads. But equally, we have to be able to lead with our hearts. And that is things like empathy, humility, self-awareness, Jenna, and courage to speak up. And you have to be able to have both. And for me, the art of modern leadership is knowing what is needed when. But we've actually got all of those in abundance. It's just that for many people, through the cultures they work in or their lifetime careers, they keep a lot of that heart-based leadership for home or their community. So I'm really encouraging people to integrate the leader they are with their grandchildren, just as a hypothetical example, with the people they work with elsewhere.
I'm pretty confident that I couldn't actually blow raspberries into the tummies of some of the people who led me. Anyhow, that's for another time.
But you have a lot of empathy with your grandchildren. I know that for a fact. So when you say you're short on empathy, I think that's where you're thinking of it in the context of a workplace, whereas you actually have the skills. I'm just going to encourage you to bring it all together.
Speaking of encouragement, I feel like our actual leaders, our political leaders, need a bit of that encouragement. How would you say Albo and Dutto are going on the head heart leadership spectrum?
I think I'm going to make it a campaign that any candidate going up for pre-selection has to go through the head and heart leader scale.
It's a genius idea, because I have a feeling,
isn't it?
Dutton might need a little bit of help in the heart area. Tell me what you think.
Well, I definitely think whether that is accurate or not, that is the perception out there. And so feedback is always valid. And I think he needs to listen to the feedback that he is perceived as being particularly weak on his heart-based leadership. But I mean, whether it's him or some of the most horrendous leaders in the world, they all have these attributes. It's just there's this real lack of confidence to be able to bring it into the public sphere. And you only have to look at the Jacinda Ardern's or Volodymyr Zelensky's and things to see that leaders who actually are able to bring those together stand out, because we see it's all too rarely.
What stops people bringing their heart into their leadership in the workplace?
Well, they get kicked up the arse if they're vulnerable, or if they say they don't know the answer. They might work in a workplace where that is just not okay to sort of be yourself and to say, actually, you know, I'm really struggling with this particular task, but I know that all of you guys have got the answers. Why don't we work together? Now, just saying that seems so simple, and it'll build trust with your team. Lots of cultures that's easy, but there's heaps of cultures where it's not. And, Dutton came through the Queensland Police Service back in the 90s and things. I'm sure that was not the culture where he first became a leader, where that was easily practiced. And so, one of the staggering bits of data that comes out in the book is the research that shows the first time people get any leadership exposure or training is 13 years after they've first led someone. So that's 13 years to stuff it up and to have to then, fix the mistakes you've already made.
Do you think that our organisations do a good job of teaching leadership?
As a general rule, no. As a general rule, firstly, there's that 13 years that nothing's happening when we should be getting in really early. I think there's a lot of emphasis placed on technical ability, industry knowledge, sales, all of those really head-based, tangible things that we can see, feel and measure. Whereas you look at every corporate scandal and every failure at the top, it's generally been because of some lacking in humility or self-awareness or whatever it is. I think my next book I'm going to focus on, the opposite of head and heart leaders, because that's the leaders we hear about too often. So I do think we in the corporate world need to do a lot better at recognizing and rewarding different kinds of leaders.
Now, you spoke to a hell of a lot of leaders for your book. Oh, my goodness, so many. I cannot believe it. There are some really juicy bits I feel like you've left out of the book. Without naming any names, what was the most surprising revelation anyone gave you?
I think because the lived experience was so different to my own, and that's always where you learn. Eves Rees, who's a trans academic and activist, hearing about their leadership from the margins and having moved from traditional leadership into the margins once coming out as trans, I actually found that really fascinating, and about the power of being able to read a room when you're unsafe or coming through an environment that's unsafe. I really love listening to Sally McManus, again, a different kind of leader. And I interviewed Sally and the CEO of BHP, Mike Henry. Now, you cannot get two different extremes of philosophical leaders, yet there was a lot of similarities in there, and I found that really, really interesting. And Sally was very honest about situations she'd been in, like the 7:30 report, one of her first big interviews, that how vulnerable she felt and how terrifying that was. Yet what I love about Sally is she does not step back from any of her comments or views. And she's exactly the kind of leader that movement, the ACTU, needs. It wouldn't work in lots of other environments, but it absolutely is brilliant in that environment.
Now, just being more specific about the book, I'm going to whiz you through the 8 attributes, and I'm going to ask you to tell me in one sentence what they each mean. So let's start with capability. What does it mean?
You have a growth mindset towards whatever it is you do. And I know you will hate that lingo. So basically it means you want to get better at what you do and you believe you can do what you do.
Perspective.
You can read a room.
Wisdom.
So that's my least capable attribute, but it's really important. It's about making decisions and weighing up data and evidence and risk and reward and going the best way forward.
And my favorite one, curiosity.
It's rabbit holes on Google. It's being curious about not just some things, but anything, and challenging your assumptions and rethinking what you thought you knew.
Also, for the journalists out there, it's also being happy to ask a million prying questions on the telephone. Nosiness for the win.
For anyone else, that is not the way to be curious. And I specifically point that out in the book, that leaders should not be asking millions of prying questions.
Journalists have got to do that, though. What about humility?
Well, that's really, we know what humility means, but in this context, it's about being willing to accept you don't know everything and being aware of your limitations. So you are open to other people's opinions and ways of doing things.
And what about self-awareness? That seems pretty self-explanatory. Is there something I don't get about that?
Well, we could question your self-awareness on your self-awareness, but in particular, it's about being aware of the impact that we're having on others and the legacy we're leaving in our wake.
So it's kind of linked to the whole perspective thing, right? Like
these are all linked, and in the book I talk about the research I did with QUT. The most, one of the 8 that correlates the most with all of them is reading the room. It's leading with perspective. If you can read a room or your industry or the organisation or whatever it is, the country, you're more likely to have a lot of these other attributes.
What about courage?
Speaking up for what you believe in, even in the face of pressure not to do so.
And finally, empathy.
Well, empathy, to be honest, I reckon empathy is the most misunderstood, because it's not sympathy or pity or compassion. It's not, listening to a sob story of someone at work and then needing to feel upset yourself. None of that's helpful. But it is about being prepared to accept there are lived experiences other than your own and putting yourself in their shoes. And I've linked the definition in this sense to diversity and inclusion, because unless you're willing to accept there's diverse experiences and then include them in your decision making, you're not going to lead with empathy.
Now, so you've got everyone buying this book. Tell me what it is that you want people to do after they've finished reading it.
Well, I would love them to jump onto headheartleader.com, because that's really where you can find out what this means for you. Like, it'll show you, and we can talk about your results if you'd like, Jenna, but it will show you how you score on each of those 8 attributes, and it'll compare your results to others. And then it'll just list, in strength. But the big thing is to go and get feedback from the people that you lead, because we're not really the best judges of how we're going, as much as we might like to think we're self-aware or humble. There's great, how did you score on humility, Jenna?
Very, very low, and I'm not surprised.
Well, actually, so the research shows that people who are really humble self-assess themselves as being not humble at all, because they are, of course, humble. But perhaps if we were to ask other people, they might score you very differently around humility. So go and get feedback. And then there's a whole action plan in the book. So there's lots of different things that you can be doing and questions to ask.
And do you think that we can you improve as a leader? Have you observed anyone improving as a leader?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're open to this kind of stuff, you're already halfway there. You're open to accepting that you're not already brilliant. Donald Trump, he's probably not going to read this book, and his leadership could do with a lot of help. And I'm not sure that he could ever really turn things around. We'd have to start with humility there. But this is the very bestest leadership book, Jenna, and it's the biggest and bestest leadership book. And he really needs to sort of get behind that.
Leadership, yeah.
It's bigly. This is the bigliest leadership book.
Help me.
Kafifi, and all that.
And what are you going to do next after you've told everyone how they should be leaders? What's the next thing for you?
Well, I'm not telling them. I'm suggesting ideas for them to think about. Taking on the world, Jenna. Who knows? Look, I want to keep writing. I've got some ideas for the next books, and speaking to fabulous people like you. Is that sucky enough? I'll buy you lunch.
You definitely do not need to suck up to me. I'm already a fan. Thank you very much for coming today. Anyone who wants to buy the book can buy it from Booktopia if they've got any. God knows if they've got any. Thanks.
They do. Booktopia have been incredibly supportive. So they have oodles. Go to Booktopia.
See ya. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.